He gave his jacket to a shivering native girl. The next morning, 200 warriors surrounded his home. He wasn't expecting this. The sun, a merciless copper coin in a vast, bleached blue sky, beat down upon the land, baking the dust into a fine ochre powder that rose with every step. Ethan Stone felt its heat on the back of his neck, a familiar weight he had carried for all of his 24 years. His world was one of fences that needed mending, cattle that needed driving, and a silence so profound it seemed to have a sound of its own, a low hum of wind through sparse prairie grass and the distant, mournful cry of a hawk. His ranch was his inheritance, a sprawling tract of land carved out of the wilderness by his father and his father before him. It was a legacy of sweat, calloused hands, and a stubborn refusal to be broken by drought or blizzard. But it was a solitary legacy. The homestead, a sturdy log and stone structure that stood defiant against the horizon, felt cavernous and empty, its silence a constant reminder of the family that was no more. His days were a rhythm of hard labor, a metronome of chores that began before the sun had even thought of rising and ended long after it had bled out across the western plains. He would rise in the pre-dawn chill, the air sharp and clean in his lungs, and the first task was always the same, stoking the embers in the hearth. The scent of coffee, rich and dark, would be the first to break the night's hold, followed by the sizzle of bacon in a cast-iron skillet. He moved with an economy of motion born from years of repetition, his lean, wiry frame a testament to a life lived on the edge of civilization. This particular afternoon was no different. He was riding the southern fence line, his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust, plodding along with a familiar, comforting gait. The leather of the saddle creaked a familiar song, a counterpoint to the jingle of his spurs. He was checking for brakes, his eyes scanning the taut wire, a skill so ingrained it was almost subconscious. The world was a panorama of rolling hills, golden under the late afternoon sun, and the distant, hazy blue of the mountains that walled in his valley. It was a beautiful, unforgiving land, and he loved it with a fierce, possessive passion that he could never quite put into words. It was in this state of focused solitude that he saw her. At first, she was just a flicker of movement near the cottonwood grove that drank from the shallow creek, a splash of color that didn't belong. He reined Dust to a halt, his hand instinctively resting on the stock of the rifle holstered to his saddle. Strangers were a rarity, and caution was a tool as essential as a hammer or a length of rope. As he drew closer, the figure resolved into a young woman. She was Native American, her heritage etched in the high cheekbones, the straight black hair that fell in a single braid over her shoulder, and the dark, almond-shaped eyes that watched him approach with a wariness that mirrored his own. She was on foot, her moccasins scuffed and dusty, and she wore a simple deerskin dress. But it was the way she held herself that caught his attention. She shivered, not violently but with a persistent, bone-deep tremor that even the oppressive heat of the day could not quell. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her torso, her knuckles white. She looked exhausted, her face smudged with dirt and fatigue, yet there was an unbroken spirit in her gaze, a pride that refused to yield. Ethan dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, a universal language of non-aggression. He kept a respectful distance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "You all right? You look cold." It was a foolish thing to say in the blistering heat, but it was the only word that fit the tremors racking her body. Her eyes, dark and deep as a forest pool at midnight, flickered from his face to the horse and back again. She didn't speak, but he saw a flicker of something in them, fear, yes, but also a desperate plea. He saw the goosebumps on her arms, the slight blue tinge to her lips. She was in shock, perhaps, or suffering from a fever that created its own internal winter. He didn't know the customs of her people, the Shoshone who lived in the mountains beyond his valley, but he knew basic human decency. Without a second thought, he shrugged off the heavy canvas and wool-lined jacket he wore. It was a part of him, smelling of leather, horse, and wood smoke, stained with the honest dirt of his labor. He stepped forward slowly, holding it out to her. "Here," he offered, "take this. It'll help." As she watched him, her gaze unwavering, assessing his intent. For a long moment she didn't move. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind in the cottonwoods and the buzz of insects. Then, with a slow, hesitant grace, she reached out and took the jacket. Her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt like static electricity passed between them. It was a fleeting, insignificant touch, yet it felt strangely momentous. She pulled the jacket on. It was far too large for her, swallowing her slender frame, the sleeves dangling past her fingertips. But as she drew it around herself, a visible sigh of relief escaped her lips. The shivering lessened, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. She looked up at him, and for the first time the guarded wall in her eyes lowered. She spoke a single word, a soft, musical sound in a language he didn't understand, but the meaning was universal. "Thank you." He just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "You be careful heading home," he said, though he wasn't sure she understood. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked away, not back toward the mountains, but along the creek, disappearing back into the shimmering heat haze from which she had emerged. Ethan watched her go, the oversized jacket a moving patch of brown against the golden landscape, until she was gone. He stood there for a long time, feeling strangely exposed without the familiar weight on his shoulders, a lingering sense of her presence hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. The next morning broke cold and sharp. A mist clung to the low-lying areas of the valley, muffling the world in a blanket of gray and silver. Ethan woke with a sense of unease he couldn't shake. The air was too still. The usual morning chorus of birds was absent. An unnatural silence pressed in on the homestead, heavy and expectant. He pulled on his trousers and boots, a shiver running down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning chill. He moved to the small window in the main room, rubbing the condensation from the glass. And then he saw them. His blood ran cold. The breath hitched in his chest, and his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. His land, his sanctuary, was no longer his. From the edge of the woods to the banks of the creek, surrounding his home in a silent, intimidating crescent, were warriors. Not a dozen, not 50, but what looked to his stunned eyes like hundreds. They sat astride their war ponies, which stamped and blew steam in the frigid air. The men were statues of hardened muscle and grim purpose. Some wore ornate war bonnets of eagle feathers that cascaded down their backs. Others had their faces painted in stark, terrifying patterns of red and black. They held lances, bows, and a few had rifles resting across their laps. They were utterly silent, their collective gaze fixed on his small house, a tide of silent menace waiting to crash upon his shore. Fear, primal and icy, seized him. He was one man. They were an army. Every horror story he'd ever heard from other settlers, tales of raids and massacres, flashed through his mind. He was trapped, a fly in a web of silent, patient spiders. His hand went to his rifle propped by the door, but he knew it was a futile gesture. To raise it would be suicide. He could perhaps take one or two with him, but the outcome was inevitable. All he could do was wait. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun began to climb, burning away the mist, and still they did not move. The tension was a physical thing, a pressure building in the air until he felt he would suffocate. Finally, a single figure detached himself from the main group and rode forward. He was older than the others, his face a roadmap of deep lines carved by time, sun, and sorrow. He wore a chief's bonnet, its feathers trailing almost to the ground, and he carried himself with an aura of immense authority, his back straight, his gaze piercing. He rode not a wiry war pony, but a magnificent black stallion that seemed to exude the same pride as its rider. He halted a respectful distance from the porch, his eyes locking onto Ethan's through the window. This had to be their leader. Taking a deep, ragged breath, Ethan knew he couldn't hide in his house forever. It was a coward's move, and his father had not raised a coward. Straightening his shoulders, he unbolted the heavy oak door and stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the morning light. He kept his hands open and away from his sides, showing he was unarmed. The chief watched him, his expression unreadable, a mask of stoic gravity. "I am Kalen," the chief said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried easily in the still air. It was clear, unaccented English spoken with deliberation. "Chief of the Shoshone people." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. "Ethan Stone," he managed to say. Kalen's dark eyes scanned Ethan's face, searching for something. "Yesterday," the chief began, his voice dropping even lower, "my daughter Leela came this way. She was wearing a dress of deerskin. She was not wearing a rancher's jacket." The words hung in the air, a quiet accusation. Ethan's mind reeled. Leela, that was her name, the girl from the creek, the chief's daughter. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. I gave it to her," Ethan stammered, the full weight of his situation crashing down on him. "She was cold, sick. I meant no harm. I was just trying to help." Kalen's gaze didn't soften, but a flicker of something, perhaps understanding, perhaps deeper worry, passed through his eyes. He dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his age and took a step closer. The warriors behind him remained motionless, a silent, painted jury. "The jacket you gave her was found this morning by the river," Kalen said, his voice heavy with a pain he could no longer completely conceal. "It was torn and covered in mud. There were signs of a struggle, but of my daughter, Leela, there is no sign. She has vanished." The chief's stoicism finally cracked, revealing the raw grief of a father. "She is gone." The air rushed out of Ethan's lungs. Leela missing. The image of her shivering form, her grateful eyes, flooded his mind. He had tried to help, and somehow it had led to this. A wave of guilt washed over him, followed by a surge of anger at whoever had taken her. He looked past Kalen at the sea of grim faces, then back at the chief's anguished eyes. They were no longer chief and settler, but two men connected by a missing girl. In that moment, a decision formed in his mind, a choice born not of logic or strategy, but of a fundamental sense of right and wrong. "I'll help you find her," Ethan said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "I know this land, every creek, every hollow. I can track. Let me help." Kalen studied him for a long, silent moment. The fate of this young white man who stood alone before 200 warriors hung in the balance. The chief saw not a threat, but a sincerity in Ethan's eyes, a shared purpose. He gave a slow, solemn nod. "You will ride with us," he declared. He turned to his warriors and issued a series of sharp commands in his native tongue. The vast majority of the war party wheeled their horses around and began the ride back towards the mountains, their purpose for being there, intimidation fulfilled. A smaller group, perhaps 20 of the most elite warriors, remained, their faces hard and impassive. Kalen gestured for one of them to bring a spare horse for Ethan. "We ride now," Kalen said, his focus already shifting to the trail, to the daughter he had to find. The trail grows cold with every passing moment. Ethan quickly saddled Dust, his hands moving with practiced speed. He grabbed his rifle, a canteen, and a small pack of supplies. As he joined the Shoshone party, he felt the weight of their suspicious stares. He was an outsider, an intruder in their world of grief and vengeance. Kalen rode at the head of the group, his eyes fixed on the ground, reading the subtle language of the earth. Ethan rode beside him, his own gaze sweeping the terrain, looking for anything out of the ordinary. The initial hours were a tense, silent affair. The warriors communicated in their own language, their glances toward Ethan filled with mistrust. He was the last person to see Leela. To some, he was undoubtedly the prime suspect. But as the day wore on, Ethan's knowledge of the land began to prove its worth. He pointed out a game trail that offered a shortcut through a dense thicket, saving them precious time. He identified a set of tracks overlaid on the others, noting how the horse was shod differently, not with the iron shoes of a settler, but with a method he didn't recognize, suggesting a rider from another tribe. Kalen listened, his initial reserve slowly giving way to a grudging respect. He began to confer with Ethan, pointing out signs, a broken twig, a disturbed stone, and asking for the rancher's interpretation. They were learning to speak a shared language, the language of the hunt. Their search led them away from the open plains and into the rugged foothills that were a prelude to the high mountains. The ground grew rocky, the landscape twisted into gullies and ravines. It was here, in a dried-out riverbed, that they found a crucial clue. It was a single black feather, tied with a strip of red-dyed leather caught on a thorny bush. Kalen dismounted and picked it up, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. "Rorik," he spat the name like a curse. "He is a warrior from a rival band, a man cast out from his own people for his cruelty. He has long coveted our lands, our horses. He believes strength is measured only by what one can take by force." The mood of the party darkened. This was no longer just a search. It was a rescue from a known and dangerous enemy. The warriors' hands tightened on their weapons, their faces set in grim lines. But as they pressed on, a more insidious discovery was made. One of Kalen's own warriors, a tall, sullen man named Brennan, who had been vocal in his suspicion of Ethan, was seen lagging behind. Another warrior, loyal to Kalen, noticed Brennan subtly trying to obscure a part of the trail with his horse's hooves. When confronted, Brennan's defiance was immediate, but his eyes darted around nervously. A quick search of his saddlebags revealed a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a known token of Rorik's band. The betrayal was like a knife in the back to the proud Shoshone. Brennan had been feeding information to Rorik, hoping to gain favor and power when Kalen was weakened by the loss of his daughter. Kalen's judgment was swift and terrible. He disarmed Brennan and declared him an exile, to be left to the mercy of the wilderness he had sought to sell. The shame-faced warrior was cast out, and the group rode on, smaller in number but united by a renewed, hardened resolve. The treachery had shaken them, but it had also focused their rage. The trail, now clearer thanks to their undivided attention, led them deeper into the mountains, toward a formidable canyon whose sheer rock walls were stained red and black by time and weather. The entrance was a narrow slit, a gateway into a labyrinth of stone. As they entered, the temperature dropped and the sky was reduced to a narrow ribbon of blue far above. The acoustics of the place were eerie. The clatter of their horses' hooves echoed back at them, multiplied and distorted as if a ghostly army rode alongside them. Ethan felt a prickling on his skin, the instinct of a man who knows the land. This was a natural fortress, a perfect place for an ambush. "Kalen," he said, his voice low. "This place, it's a trap." Kalen nodded grimly, his hand already raised to halt the party. "I know," he replied, "but it is the only way forward. He has her in here. I can feel it." It was then that the trap was sprung. A chilling war cry echoed from the cliffs above, and suddenly the canyon rims were lined with Rorik's warriors. A volley of arrows rained down upon them, hissing through the air like angry hornets. One of Kalen's men cried out and fell from his horse, an arrow buried in his shoulder. Chaos erupted. Kalen shouted orders, his voice sharp and clear above the din, directing his men to take cover behind the massive boulders that littered the canyon floor. The Shoshone warriors, though outnumbered, were disciplined and fierce. They returned fire with their bows, their own arrows seeking out targets on the rim. Ethan dove from Dust's back, rolling behind a rock outcropping as an arrow thudded into the ground where he'd been a second before. He unslung his rifle, the familiar weight of the Winchester a small comfort in the terrifying pandemonium. He wasn't a warrior, trained in the art of bow and lance, but he was a marksman. He took a steadying breath, lined up his sights on a figure leaning out from the rim, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a deafening crack in the enclosed space, echoing like a thunderclap. The figure above clutched his chest and tumbled from sight. The battle raged, a brutal, close-quarters affair. Arrows flew, warriors clashed with knives and tomahawks in the canyon below, their cries of fury and pain echoing off the stone walls. It was a whirlwind of desperate survival. Amidst the swirling chaos, Ethan scanned the cliffs, his eyes searching frantically. And then he saw her. High above the canyon floor, on a narrow, almost inaccessible ledge, was Leela. She was bound, a gag in her mouth, but her eyes were wide and defiant, blazing with fury. Beside her stood a hulking figure, his face a brutal mask of scars and malevolent glee, Rorik. He was using her as a shield, taunting Kalen from his high perch. Kalen saw her at the same moment, and a raw, agonized cry was torn from his throat. He started towards the cliff face, but Rorik just laughed, holding a knife to Leela's throat. Kalen was pinned down, forced to fight the battle below while his daughter's life hung by a thread above. Ethan knew what he had to do. While the battle raged, distracting Rorik and his men, he saw his chance. The rock face below Leela's ledge was sheer, but it was not impossible. It was filled with cracks and handholds, a vertical puzzle waiting to be solved. Handing his rifle to a nearby warrior, he whispered, "Cover me." Before anyone could object, he was moving. He sprinted to the base of the cliff and began to climb. His rancher's life had given him strong hands and a wiry strength. He found purchase for his fingers and toes in the smallest of crevices, his muscles straining, his lungs burning. The rock was rough against his skin, scraping his knuckles raw. Arrows from above zipped past him, chipping stone from the cliff face near his head. Below, the battle was a symphony of violence, but for Ethan, the world had shrunk to the few feet of rock in front of him. It was just him, the stone, and the goal of the ledge above. Twice his foot slipped, sending a shower of pebbles clattering down and his heart leaping into his throat. But he held on, driven by the image of Leela's terrified, defiant eyes. Finally, his fingers closed over the lip of the ledge. With a final, desperate heave, he pulled himself up and over, rolling onto the flat stone, gasping for air. Rorik, his attention on the battle below, spun around in shock, his eyes widening in disbelief. Before the larger man could react, Ethan launched himself forward, tackling Rorik around the waist. They crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs. Rorik was stronger, his muscles like iron bands, and he quickly gained the upper hand, his fingers closing around Ethan's throat. As Ethan's vision began to swim with black spots, he saw Leela. She had managed to work her hands partially free of her bonds. Her eyes were fixed on something just behind him. The path, she choked out, her voice raspy from the gag. There is a hidden path behind the rocks. Then her gaze shifted to the rifle Ethan's companion had left near the edge of the ledge after providing cover. With a surge of desperate strength, she wriggled free, scrambled across the stone, and grabbed the heavy Winchester. She wasn't a damsel in distress. She was a chief's daughter, a survivor. She leveled the rifle, the stock unsteady against her shoulder, and aimed it at Rorik, who was still straddling Ethan. Rorik saw her and froze, a sneer twisting his lips. "You don't have the nerve, girl," he taunted. A deafening crack echoed across the canyon. Rorik roared in pain, not triumph, and clutched his leg, where a crimson flower was blooming on his buckskin trousers. He stumbled backward, his leg buckling beneath him. The shot broke the spell of the battle. Below, the warriors, both Rorik's and Kaelin's, looked up. Seeing their leader wounded and the hostage armed and free, Rorik's men faltered. Their morale shattered. Kaelin seized the moment, letting out a thunderous war cry and leading a final, furious charge. The tide had turned. Rorik, snarling in pain and fury, saw his defeat was imminent. He hobbled to the edge of the cliff and, with a final hateful glare at Ethan and Leela, disappeared down a hidden crevice, the very path Leela had revealed. His remaining warriors broke and fled, melting back into the canyon's maze. Silence, sudden and profound, fell over the canyon, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of the survivors. In the aftermath, as Kaelin and his warriors secured the canyon and tended to their own, Ethan was no longer an outsider. He was a hero. The warriors who had once eyed him with suspicion now clapped him on the back, their faces filled with a newfound respect and awe. They called him Eagle Climber and Stone Hand. Kaelin approached him, his stoic mask gone, replaced by an expression of profound, overwhelming gratitude. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You saved my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have fought as one of us. My debt to you is one I can never fully repay. My home is your home. My people are your people." Ethan's life, once defined by fences and solitude, was irrevocably transformed. He was no longer just Ethan Stone, the lonely rancher. He was a man who had bled with Shoshone warriors, who had earned the respect of a chief, who had become part of a story far larger than his own patch of land. He had found a connection, a community, in the most unlikely and violent of circumstances. Later, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Ethan stood with Leela near the creek where they had first met. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with the weight of all that had passed. The world seemed quieter, more peaceful. She wore his jacket, the canvas, and wore a shield of comfort around her. "You should have this back," she said softly, making a move to shrug it off. Ethan reached out and gently stopped her, his hand resting on the sleeve. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You keep it. You earned it more than I ever did." He looked at her, at the strength in her dark eyes, the resilience that had endured capture and fear. The jacket was no longer just a piece of clothing he had given away. It was a symbol of her bravery, a testament to the fire within her that had refused to be extinguished. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that lit up her face. "Thank you, Ethan Stone," she said. A deep understanding passed between them, a bond forged in fear and battle, a silent promise of a future yet to be written. As he watched her walk back toward the mountains, the oversized jacket a familiar shape against the twilight, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. His ranch was still there. The fences would still need mending, but he was no longer alone in the vast, silent land. He had found his place.